Hello ladles and jelly spoons, and welcome back to another spooky video in celebration of Halloween week. Today I'm going to run through a list of the most overrated horror films of all time. I feel like the only result that can come of this video is that obviously I'm telling people not to watch these films because they're bad, but by telling people not to watch the films is only going to make them want to watch them more. But because horror is subjective, I don't suppose it matters, because there is a chance that even though I don't personally like these films, other people are going to like them, and the fact that these films are so highly rated probably proves that I'm the one that's wrong. So number 6 is The Witch, which is the 2015 film starring Anya Taylor-Joy. Now, I think the main reason I didn't enjoy this film is quite frankly because I didn't get it. So it seems that the plot centres around a family that is banished into the woods over a religious dispute, and while they're living in the woods, their baby gets kidnapped by what they believe is a witch. They then start to believe that somebody within the family is the witch or is a witch and is responsible for the baby's disappearance. This leads to the family fighting amongst one another and leads to death and gore and whatever. And there's a whole bunch of bizarre scenes involving a goat, which again I just didn't understand as I was watching the film. And although people might find those scenes disturbing and creepy and would make them like the film, for me it just made the film too bizarre. In fairness, I might benefit from a rewatch of this film because I feel like if I watched it again I might understand the plot more. But the fact that I couldn't understand it on the first watch makes it, in my opinion, not a film for me. Number 5 is The Babadook, which is a 2014 Australian horror film. Now, I think the problem with this film for me is that it was so overhyped. There was information all over the internet hailing this as the scariest horror movie ever made, or the scariest horror movie of our generation. And the main reason that I was so excited for this film is that William Friedkin, who is the director of The Exorcist, said that it was the scariest film he'd ever seen. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but The Exorcist is my favourite film of all time, so obviously high praise coming from him. In my opinion, The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever made, so if he thought it was that great, then it must have been. Unfortunately, not so much. Now, the plot of this film centres around a mother and son who are grieving after the loss of the son's father. The father passed away before the son was born, but basically it's resulted in a horrendous kind of grief, mourning atmosphere in the house. And it's basically just them trying to deal with their grief. The son then begins to believe in something called the Babadook, which is a character that comes from a pop-up book that the child's found, and he starts to become obsessed with this Babadook character. The mum's becoming stressed with the kid because he won't sleep, and he's getting in trouble at school because of his belief in this character. And then she begins to believe in the character, which starts to make her family believe that she's going crazy or that she can't handle her child, which is kind of a good plot. But in the film they use this drab colour scheme and dark setting, which I think is supposed to make the film scary, but ends up just making it super depressing. So I don't feel like I was scared at all by the movie. I was just made to feel really, really sad. And not to mention the child who plays the son in this film is, I swear to God, the most annoying and frustrating child on the planet. Like, I understand he's going through a bad time, but there's this scene where he's in the back of the car and he's just screaming the place down, and he's just such an I mean, I have never ever wanted to scream in a child's face so much in my life. He's incredibly, incredibly annoying, and I think that ruined the film a lot for me, is that they chose a really bad child actor for the part. Number 4 is Annabelle, which most people know is a film that came out in 2012. I think the main fault of this film is that it's based on the true legend of Annabelle, or supposedly true legend of Annabelle, and the story of the film just doesn't add up to the real legend itself. And even though personally I don't believe in the legend of Annabelle, I think that it's all made up, I can still appreciate it for what it is, and it's a good tale, a good story, a good legend. However, the plot within the film, which is this cheesy plot which centres around this young couple being given the doll as a gift for their small child, and then obviously the doll and spooky things started happening in the house, etc, etc. Not to mention bad acting, bad effects. Overall, the film just didn't work. And also the fact that they used a kind of puppet porcelain doll instead of a rag doll, which is what the real Annabelle doll was. I feel like they could have still used a rag doll but made it scarier with a little bit of effects and makeup and things, and they just didn't. They used a completely different doll altogether, and I just feel like that takes away from the kind of realism of it being based on a true story, so to speak. Number 3 is The Descent, which is a 2005 British horror film. I think there's a lot of personal bias comes into this one because I just don't personally enjoy British horror films. One of the main reasons that I watch horror films is for escapism, so I tend to like them being kind of Hollywood American films. So I can feel like in my head like maybe this happened because maybe crazy things like this just happen in America. But when a horror film's set in England, I just watch it and think like, yeah, that never happened. Also, for some reason I didn't find the plot that scary. It's basically a group of girls are out on a hiking exhibition, a woodland exhibition. They end up going underground into an underground cave, I guess, and they start to get terrorized by these demonic kind of demon dog-esque creatures, which I can understand why other people would be scared of that, but just personally for me, I'm not a fan of kind of like creature features or creature horror. I prefer paranormal and atmospherical films as opposed to just kind of like chuck in this scary looking creature and see what happens. I think the main plus point of this film, something that goes in its favour, is that there's 2 separate endings. So if you don't already know this, or if you haven't seen this film and you intend to watch this film, just skip this little bit because spoiler alert. But at the end of the US version of the film, I think it is, basically the film ends with the main character getting out of the caves fine, and she gets in a car and it's kind of driven away, and she has a bit of a hallucination, but otherwise the assumption is that she gets out and she's safe and she's fine. However, in the UK version, we still see her escaping in this car. However, it turns out she wakes up back in the cave and the scene in which she escapes is just her own hallucination, and she's not okay and she gets attacked and essentially she dies. So I do think it has that plus point in that it has the 2 separate endings, but otherwise, as I say, I just don't think the plot was for me. Number 2 is Drag Me to Hell, which is a 2009 film starring Alison Lohman and Justin Long. For me, I think the main reason I didn't enjoy this film is because it takes itself too seriously. I guess it's supposed to be a comedy / horror, but because the plot is so bizarre and it's terrible special effects, and just generally it's a goofy movie, but a goofy movie that almost has this like serious underline. It tries to be too scary for what is a silly film. It reminds me a lot of the Stephen King film Thinner, which I actually really enjoy and is one of my favourite films. I love it. That's a kind of comedy horror, and it really, really hams up the goofy side. It's got a similar plot to Drag Me to Hell. Drag Me to Hell is where the young girl, she's a loan officer and she refuses a loan to a gypsy lady who then puts a curse on her, and the rest of the film centres around the young girl trying to get the curse removed and what happens afterwards. Thinner is a similar plot where a lawyer basically does something to wrong a gypsy family and ends up getting a curse put on him. The curse which then causes him to get thinner and thinner and thinner until essentially he's going to starve to death unless he gets the curse removed. As I say, Thinner is extremely hammy and it just really sells the comedy side. It's bad acting, it's bad costumes and makeup. It's silly, it's slightly offensive if I'm honest, but because it's so silly it can kind of almost get away with it. So I really enjoy that film. However, Drag Me to Hell, as I say, it tries to be too much horror. It almost forgets that it's got this goofy storyline and tries to be too scary. And my personal number 1 most overrated horror movie of all time, this is pretty controversial because this is honestly one of the most popular and well-known horror movies ever, is the 1978 film Halloween starring Jamie Lee Curtis. And I think the main reason is because I don't understand why Michael Myers is scary. I'm guessing there must be some kind of further explanation in the sequels which explains why he's scary. Perhaps he's possessed or he's demonic or something. I'm not sure why he's so scary, but as far as I know, he's just a regular guy. There's a particular scene where Jamie Lee Curtis she's being attacked by Michael Myers, so she runs out of the house and she runs down the street, and Michael Myers is miles behind her. He's nowhere near her, and I just think like at this point she could literally stroll down the street and he wouldn't catch up with her, because this is one element of the character that I find so frustrating, is that he just walks slowly and doesn't run after anybody. So I feel like if you just ran at a kind of jogging pace, you could get away from him fine. And instead of continuing down the street, her character turns around and runs back to the house, which is just the worst decision. And I guess in 1978 this wasn't a trope yet, and it probably was the beginning of the trope of the girl runs back into the house and runs into her bedroom instead of running away and finding a police officer. See, this kind of baddie goes really slowly effect can work really well when it's done in the right way. For example, the film It Follows, which in fairness was clearly heavily inspired by Halloween, both in the soundtrack and the way that the kind of killer moves. But this is done really well because the baddie, the bad thing in It Follows, is supernatural. So although it moves really slowly and it's pretty easy to get away from the thing, there's this kind of knowledge in the victims' heads that yeah, they can keep running, but eventually it's going to catch up with them because it's supernatural, it's paranormal. You can't get rid of the thing, you can't get rid of the virus until you pass it on to somebody else. So it doesn't matter how fast you run, it's always going to catch up to you eventually. However, as far as I'm aware, as I say, I could be wrong, but Michael Myers is just a guy. So if you run fast enough and far enough, you can eventually get to a police station where there'll be policemen with guns and handcuffs and you'll be fine. So for me, I just don't understand why that's scary. I pretty much feel like if Michael Myers walked into this house right now, I hope he doesn't, but if he did, I could get away quite easily. The chase between Michael Myers and Jamie Lee Curtis's character builds to a really disappointing climax as well, in which basically he attacks her behind the couch and she stabs him and he falls to the ground, which is done in such a terrible way. He falls like a sack of spuds to the ground, which initially I thought, because it's done in such a bizarre way and the character looks so small and the mask is so cheap and tacky looking, I originally thought that the person she'd stabbed was just a neighbourhood child dressed up for Halloween as Michael Myers, or wearing a similar mask to what Michael wears. I thought the point in the story was that she was going to have stabbed some little kid and she was going to take the mask off and realise that she'd stabbed the wrong person, and that to me would have been interesting. However, it's not, it's actually is Michael Myers and she stabs him, he falls to the floor like a sack of spuds. She then, instead of running out of the house, okay, fine, she's attacked him, she's got him on the floor where she needs him to be. Instead of running out the house and going to find help, she goes upstairs. And I think it's because there's some little kids in the house, so she's going to get the little kids to get them out of the house to make sure they're all right. And in the process, Michael Myers comes for her again and she has to hide in her wardrobe, at which point she fashions a coat hanger into kind of like a weapon, a makeshift weapon. And then when Michael Myers breaks in the wardrobe, she stabs him again, he falls to the floor. So absolutely at this point, run out of the house and go and find a police officer, for the love of God. What does she do instead? She sits down on the floor in her doorway, facing away from Michael Myers' body that she's just stabbed. I feel like this is similar to a situation where, have you ever had it where you've been in your bedroom and there's been a spider on your wall, so you've like thrown something at a spider and it falls to the floor and you're not quite sure whether you've killed it or not? You're not sure whether it's fallen dead or whether it's just like ran under your bed. So in this situation, would you then sit down and face away from the potentially dead spider and just sit and wait for it to crawl up on your back and onto your head? You just wouldn't do it. But Jamie Lee Curtis' character decides to face away from his body, at which point obviously the body isn't dead. So he gets up and it comes for her again, at which point she's thankfully saved by this guy who's a detective or works at the hospital or something, I can't remember. And he turns up and shoots Michael Myers and she's saved and everyone's fine until the next 20 bajillion sequels that came out, which I'm hoping explain the whole concept around why Michael's scary. For me, it's just a guy in a mask and I just don't understand why somebody doesn't turn around and just punch him one. If he falls to the ground, you've got plenty of time to escape, and as I say, report him to the authorities. As I say though, it's one of the most popular horror films of all time. I'm sure it's something that I'm missing as opposed to it being a bad film. There's no way that it's a bad film, otherwise it wouldn't be so popular. But for me, I just didn't personally get it. I'm open to persuasion and I'm open to being able to change, because I would like to watch this film because then it opens me up to watching all of the sequels. But for now, it's not for me. It's not one of my guys. So thank you for watching my last video in my week of spooky videos. I'm going to let myself have a rest now because all I've done for 5 days straight is film and edit. So I'm going to let myself rest, watch some TV and drink some wine. If you like this countdown and if you like spooky content in general, please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, share and all of that nonsense. Now the eagle-eyed amongst you may notice that I can actually see in this video. which has been super helpful. My glasses originally broke at the beginning of lockdown and I've only getting around to getting new ones, so I too can now be an eagle-eyed spectator. Spec.